Hello and welcome to Holy Wars, a podcast about religion, coexistence, and the people trying to figure it out. I'm Jeremy McClellan, and my guest today is Eeman Abbasi, editor of Traversing Tradition. I've been following Eeman for a long time on Twitter, so I'm really happy that we got to talk. We discussed Islam, feminism, capitalism, monoculture, the secularization of Muslim minds, CVE and PREVENT, and Western debates about hijab. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe, rate it 5 stars on iTunes, share it with your friends, and donate to my Patreon. Every little bit helps. Thank you, and welcome to Holy Wars. Eeman, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for taking time away from Twitter to have this conversation.
It's my pleasure.
I have fantasies about just like deleting all of my social media and just like disappearing into the woods or something, because it's just too much a lot of times.
Yeah, you would not be alone. I deleted all my social media except for Twitter.
Yeah.
That's the last. Yeah.
Yeah.
One day that'll be gone too.
Well, you don't want to feel left out. You don't want to feel like there's people are talking about something and I'm not part of it.
Right.
It's like you revert back to middle school and you're like, people are having a conversation. I don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. Anyway. I'd like to apologize in advance if you hear Jewel in the background.
I love babies.
I know, she's great. Yeah, so she might be like hollering or something in the background. But I've really enjoyed following you on Twitter and reading your work over the last few years. I think you seem to be part of a group of young Muslims who are kind of gathered around blogs like Traversing Tradition, who I noticed were asking a lot of the same questions that traditional Christians like myself are asking about religion and liberalism. And one article you wrote that I really liked, I think about it once a week. Like something happens and I think about it and it got lodged in my brain. The title is Islam Poses the Last Legitimate Challenge to a Hegemonic Monoculture. Mm-hmm. And I want to start by asking what you mean by monoculture.
Mm-hmm. So monoculture, I think people, if they're not able to define it in words, they're able to define it in their senses, right? So in what they see. And the way I kind of define it is increasingly, with the force of globalization, we're consuming the same types of foods, we're consuming the same type of culture, right? The same type of media, the same type of thought. And so I think that kind of transcends things that we can observe through our senses to things that we unconsciously, internalize. So whether that's our value systems or our morals or things that, govern the way that we live our lives. Mm-hmm. And so monoculture really, I think, is this attempt by the state and by different forces to kind of shape everyone into the same type of individual. So that's and by kind
the
of,
type of individual, do you mean the external or do you mean the internal or both?
Both. So that's what I'm saying. So certain things that we can observe with our senses, right? The way that we dress or the foods that we eat or the music that we consume or the media that we watch, those are things that we can observe that increasingly it seems like all across the world, you're going to find the same fast food restaurants. You're going to find the same fashion sense. You're going to find these things that are changing, right? Architecture seems to be changing in this way that like modern architecture, wherever you go in the world, seems to be the same, right? So these are things we can observe. But then I think there's unconscious things where individuals increasingly begin to be internalizing the same type of value systems or morals. And I think there's, I personally believe that's really dangerous. And I think that's like a very concerted and artificial effort. But that's kind of what I mean by monoculture. It's both things we can observe and things that we can't. And
how does Islam, to you, challenge that?
I think Islam is kind of unique in the sense that it provides a complete alternative of life, right? So Islam, if you say when it arrived or when it really had its peak, if you will, with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it provided an alternative to financial systems, to systems of governance, to interpersonal relations. And even now, Muslims hold on to the same type of value systems that we were taught years and years ago, right? So I think Islam as a religion kind of has a complete alternative in every facet of life that I think very few other ideologies or governing systems really do.
And you have, I was trying to think of other examples of ideologies or ways of life that challenge the monoculture. And, there's like the Amish and There's like subgroups. There's like small groups that do, but they're sort of allowed to exist, within liberalism. It's sort of this truce kind of thing because there's such a small percentage of the population. But with Muslims, there's a lot of you, and and there's a kind of worry, or it's a more robust challenge, I think, to that. But I wonder if Islam couldn't fall into that, if Islam could not be appropriated successfully by the monoculture and have it be turned into something palatable.
I mean, I think there is an attempt, like I said, there is like a concerted attempt by the state, particularly in the West, to kind of reduce Islam, to minimize it and to make it something palatable, right? Something that is monocultural or is palatable to the monoculture. But I think regardless of that, we bring up these sub-communities like the Amish. I think there's a lot we can learn from the Amish, but I think even within Amish communities, there is one dominant culture that isn't true for Islam, right? So within within the Muslim community, you're going to see a huge variety in culture. So when I say Islam provides an alternative to the monoculture, it's not that it provides one singular experience of culture. This is Islam. This is Islamic culture. And, that is the monoculture. No, it's that even within Islam, there's, a multiplicity of cultures. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so scary for people who maintain the monoculture to kind of reckon with Islam in that way.
I was wondering, I was thinking about, right now we're going through Lent and Christian Ramadan or whatever, where we're fasting. But there's a lot of people who are like, what are you giving up for Lent? And it's all stuff for self-improvement. And there was actually an article written recently about the secularization of Lent, where our practices, and this is true of Christianity in general, is that a lot of the practices that we have sort of been detached and have become marketable. So that Lent becomes like a 30-day way of detoxing from social media, or which is good, but it's not what Lent is about. And where you're fasting, and the goal of fasting is you can live longer, right? But like fasting is supposed to teach you that you're going to die. It's not supposed to teach you that you're going to live forever, right? It's actually the opposite. And I'm wondering if there's been also kind of a secularization of Islam, where Muslims are being identified by things that are actually not unique to Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, this is the topic that we're tackling at Tourism Tradition, is like the secularization of Muslims, right? The secularization of Muslim minds is a piece we just published. And I think it's really remarkable how Christianity has Christianity has shown Muslims what will happen to Islam.
Right, that's kind of a warning.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel that way when I talk to Muslims. I'm like, okay, so here's what happened to us like 50 years ago.
Right. And I think we as Muslims need to be really aware of that. I think as not just Muslims, but as like faith-based individuals, who kind of use our faith to like center the work that we do or have like a moral foundation, we need to kind of recognize the threat that secularization poses, and kind of like bind together and like be natural allies of each other. Because I think, we're all to lose if that happens, like both Christians and Muslims and any like faith-based individuals have a lot to lose. If our holidays or if our religion is secularized or made palatable or made into a hallmark holiday in that way, Ramadan or Lent is not about, just feeling hunger or just, detoxing or whatever. It's about changing who you are as an individual, like you're saying, being aware of your mortality, being aware of how fleeting everything is. And it's actually a detachment from this like capitalist culture. And I think that's so scary for people, especially if you want to maintain the economy, you need people to buy in. Right. And if you have something like religion, like Islam or Christianity, that tells people you don't need to buy into the system, that you have value beyond your material possessions, that's a threat. You can't control that individual. And so I think that's why we have this like concerted effort by the state to kind of minimize the role of religion in people's lives in that way, and to make it nothing more than just like platonic or like hallmark platitudes.
Yeah, I think about that around Christmas time, because the past two Christmas times I've spent it around Muslims because I've been on tour, both Christmases with this Muslim charity with like 6 other comics, and there's always this debate in the UK about like. And like they're trying to assure everyone Muslims also celebrate Christmas, and they have these videos where Muslims are like, this is my Muslim Christmas, and they're making cookies and stuff, and it's like I feel like, if the
cute,
opposite,
but no.
yeah, it's cute. And I wonder if it's like there's this. You could have the opposite where it's like, this is my Christian Ramadan, and it's just someone losing weight or gaining weight if they eat the way that you guys do it. But like I feel that though, where there's this attempt to show Muslims they're just like everybody else, but at the same time it's leading to the secularization of our traditions.
Yeah.
And
I think,
whereas if you met someone who was a Christian who was like, I hate it when Muslims celebrate Christmas, you'd be like, you might see them as hateful, maybe not. I have no idea.
Yeah, I think efforts like that to kind of humanize Muslims, I think they're so comical. Like, I'm beyond the point of like finding them frustrating. I just find them really funny because I think people don't recognize how artificial this effort is. We have initiatives like CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism in the US, or PREVENT in the UK, whose mission, supposedly, is to counter radicalization, but really they're just efforts of like mass surveillance of making Muslims out to be like these demon spawns of terrorism, and I think the more we kind of buy into this effort of like, hug me, I'm Muslim, or look, I'm Muslim, I'm just like you, I like eat mac and cheese and watch baseball. Like, the more we kind of buy into that, the more we're kind of fueling this idea that people who don't do that, or who do, pray 5 times a day, or who do, fast regularly, or do whatever, accept Islam as the foundation of their work, that they are suddenly radicals or extremists or Islamists or whatever,
Right. I remember there was a list of signs that someone might have become radicalized. Yeah. And one of them was that they shaved their beard. And the other one was that they grew their beard out. And I was like, what is the exact amount of beard that you're allowed to have? Right. Yeah. Like just a goatee, or like it has to be 5 o'clock shadow. Like there has to be this exact, like what's the guard on the clippers that you have to use in order to not be a terrorist? And but this process that you're talking about of, I guess, the melting pot, where all of the exterior differences are shed and everybody has this standardization of values and external differences. And to me, that describes kind of the process of becoming white, where whiteness is the shedding of differences in favor of this bland, mass-produced monoculture. Like, when people joke that white people don't have a culture. And it's true that, like, and that's kind of the essence of being white, is that you don't, like, you're no longer Scottish. Like, I'm supposedly Scotch-Irish. I have no idea what that means. I have no connection to Scotland or Ireland or anything. I can go look up, like, family trees or whatever, but, like, for me, it's just like I shop at Target, And so then you have all of these, like that stripping away of becoming white. Then what are you left with? You're left with no culture, no sense of who you are as a people, and I think that's where the alt-right comes in and promises to fix that and give you an identity.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why the alt-right is so terrified of Islam, how these like Muslim crusaders or Muslim invaders are coming into our lands and taking over. I think it's very terrifying for them to know that there is this entire community of people that has a very robust system of values, that has a sense of community, that centers family, that, worships something other than the state or other than capitalism. I think that's terrifying for the alt-right to encounter. And I think
things that they know they've lost.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's like, we make a lot of memes about this, right? About how like alt-right bros, are unable to get girlfriends and that's why they hate Muslim men.
Right.
There's some truth in that, right? Of like, they've lost the sense of family, of community. And when you see someone, or when you see a community that does have that, like, why would you not be incensed by that? And I think that's really sad. I think Muslim communities, or Muslims in general, have a lot to offer in the West. And I don't want to like make a case for why Muslims need to be in the West, because I think that's so overdone and really unnecessary. But I think they would realize that we can kind of return to those values of like communalism and like drift away from the individualism that the West has experienced if we recognize that, like, this is how Muslims govern themselves, and this is something that like all people would prosper, like not just Muslims, but like faith-based individuals or anyone, would prosper if we shifted to a more communal system.
And that's one thing that I've noticed is sort of the bind here, because the liberals who are welcoming of Muslims don't have those values necessarily. And so they pitch, we need to be welcoming to Muslims, and we need to value Muslims, and their pitch is, your food, you have good tasting clothing, or economics, right? We need labor, and we need people to come and work, and they provide for us. They're good doctors, things like that. And it's never the values that, because they don't like the parts of their own community that are like that.
Right.
So you have like liberal Christians who hate conservative Christians, but they want to extend welcome to Muslims who are more similar to the conservative Christians than they are to the liberal ones.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of liberal acceptance of Muslims in the West is like this self-congratulatory, form of, look at how like non-racist and like tolerant we are, that we accept these, brown-skinned or rag-wearing, whatever, Muslims into our country. I think they don't use those terms, but there's still that like self-congratulatory sentiment of, look at how amazing we are for accepting Muslims into the West. But I think you're right. Like they want to accept all the things about us that are marketable or are, just material. And they don't want to accept any of our value systems. I think the UK right now, their whole like situation with teaching LGBT education in the school systems, and like whatever you feel about that, like I don't really care about what someone's individual opinion are, but I think that's a really great case study on how Muslims of that community have organized and has said like, oh, this education is contrary to our values, and how much difficulty liberals are having accepting that, so it's like this intolerance of liberalism. And I know this is something that you talk about a lot, but I think this is something that liberals kind of have to reckon with. Otherwise, they're going to self-destruct, because you can't purport to be tolerant and then be intolerant of anything that opposes your own values or morals. Right. And that's the myth liberals are selling.
Yeah, there's a kind of internal contradiction, I think, or maybe just an internal tension within liberalism of pluralism. And then there's this liberalism as this set of beliefs that everyone should share. And there's this tension there always, I think, because it can't go in what, like, it keeps swinging back and forth, where sometimes it's about pluralism, and then sometimes it's, well, no, we mean pluralism of food and not values. Let's go back to the hijab, because like the hijab you describe as distinct because it's external and it's explicit, you say. And it's a physical declaration of submission to God. But one thing that I've noticed, and a lot of people have noticed, is that when the hijab gets attacked, it's often justified using liberal arguments about, well, everybody has a right to wear whatever they want. And so, how do you navigate that kind of tension, or that like using liberal arguments to justify something which you also see as kind of a challenge to liberalism?
I think that's really the problem that Muslims in the West are kind of dealing with, is how do you exist in this very liberal community, or in a society that uses liberalism as their moral foundation, without internalizing some of that yourself, And I think a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, do use that same type of rhetoric when they try to justify or try to explain, the the teachings of our faith. So, I mean, while it's true that, yes, hijab is a requirement in our faith, I also believe, of course, that, any individual doesn't have the right to like mandate hijab on another person, right? That needs to be an act of devotion that comes from each worshiper towards God. That's not for me to mandate. But I think in that sense, like, yeah, it is your choice if you want to put it on, but you need to accept that it's a requirement of the faith. Whether you choose to honor that requirement is another matter. But I think in general, like, it's very, very difficult to exist without internalizing some of these teachings of liberalism, without saying things like your body, your choice, because that's not fundamentally what we believe in Islam, that it's not my body. My body is a trust given to me by God, and I'm going to be asked about it. I'm going to be held accountable for it. And if I declare myself to be a Muslim, that means I've declared myself, or I've willingly submitted to God. And so what does it mean to be a Muslim then if you're not willing to submit to God's will? And I think that's where conversations about cultural Islam come in, I'm Muslim because I celebrate Eid, twice a year, and I eat meat, or I wear fancy clothes, and that's what it means to be a Muslim. Or I'm Muslim because I consciously think about God in every action that I take, and I want to, shape my life's direction towards his will. So, yeah, I mean, there's no like easy answer there, but I think that's something we're really struggling with the Muslim community, is like getting people to recognize that we don't have to internalize this liberal rhetoric. And I think, again, like, we would do well to learn from the Christian community and work together on this.
You bring up the Women's March and the idea of the image of the Muslim woman wearing an American flag hijab. That was this very iconic image, and the goal, I think, when people put that that picture out there, I think the goal is the idea that, like, oh, well, Muslims are just as American as everybody else, and they're just as patriotic as everybody else, and like, oh, good, like that should make us relax about it. Right. What do you see instead when you see that image?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, that image kind of gives off the sense of, like a sigh of relief, like a reassurance that, oh, okay, don't worry about the Muslims. They're just like us, like they're just as patriotic. And I think we really have to question, what does it mean to be patriotic? What does it mean to take pride in being an American? Is it something to be proud of, especially as a Muslim, when we know how, like, the American state has treated Muslims both domestically and abroad, right? Like, is that something that we need to take pride in? So we need to ask those questions. And I also see, just this attempt again of like appealing to these liberal sensitivities or sensibilities of kind of reducing Muslim differences from the status quo or from the dominant culture in the West, whereby if I don't, have that type of patriotism, am I now any less American? Right? Am I, a force that needs to be controlled? And I think, like I mentioned earlier, programs like CVE and PREVENT really have this goal of like measuring patriotism or measuring like devotion to the state, because if you stray, if you dissent, you will be censored and you will be persecuted and you will be deplatformed. So, while I appreciate and I have nothing against the artist who made this, iconic photo, I think, his heart was probably in the right place, that he wanted to show like, oh, we're all neighbors, like we're in this together, blah, blah, blah. I think that's a nice sentiment. But I think we need to kind of ask, what does it mean to live in a plural society like ours? And what does it mean to be an American today? And is that something Muslims need to be striving for? Should we be proud of the differences that we have? I think that's so important, is like, especially as children, when you're raised in any country, you feel insecure about who you are. It doesn't matter if you're like white or black or Muslim or Christian or whatever, you will feel some insecurity as a child about whether you fit in with others. And I think Muslims need to kind of embrace this insecurity and embrace not fitting in, because I think if we fit into a sick society, that kind of says something about our state as well.
There's a theologian named Stanley Hauerwas who I like a lot, and he has this really great book called War and the American Difference, and it's about how America doesn't have a national identity, and it doesn't have, much of a heritage. It doesn't have a state church or like a religion. So what binds us together is war. That war is the central liturgy through which Americans come together, that we accept each other and we learn to accept each other because we fight other people. And so you have in Vietnam, blacks and whites suddenly, okay, well, we're both veterans. And that's why it's so important for like veterans to be, or the American flag hijab, right? Or to trot out, Muslim Marines and have them speak at various things to show that like, no, we can do this as well.
Yeah.
One of the things you talk about is that this idea of the Ummah, of the that Muslims don't just have this allegiance to their nation, that you have a transnational identity when you become Muslim, and that is somewhat of a challenge to this nationalism.
Yeah, I think when we observe, people like Hillary Clinton, going up there in a primary town hall and saying, the only time she mentions Muslims is, we need to utilize the Muslims that we have in this country in our counter-radicalization efforts. Or the DNC, trots out Khizr Khan and says, look, he's the father of someone who served for the U.S. and, look at how wonderful it is that, that we're allied in this way, that Muslims can help us fight their own or fight, people of their religion, so-called. I think there's a lot of truth to that, of what you're saying of Americans being united under this banner of war. And I think that's really sad. And I think we need to recognize that this is a concerted effort, that this is not something that's happening artificially, that, this idea of like Muslims always being in the West or Muslims having a meaningful place in the West may be true. Like we might have been here since, before 9/11 or since before these wars, but that doesn't mean that just because Muslims were accepted, that Islam was accepted, that our moral foundation or our values or our systems of governance or our communal structures or whatever it may be were accepted. And I think we really need to recognize that. And I think it's really uncomfortable for liberals to accept that. They may accept Muslims, but they certainly don't accept Islam.
That's really interesting. How do you feel about expressions of solidarity that use the hijab? I'm thinking about, Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, who is agnostic, but she was wearing hijab in all of these pictures in solidarity with Muslim victims.
I think that's a conversation that, local Muslim communities need to have. I know that women in the US and the UK were really frustrated to see that happen. But as far as I'm aware, there's like a Muslim Women's Council in New Zealand that had a conversation about this and decided that they were okay with it. So I think that's a local conversation to have. I think reducing the hijab into just this, how would you describe it? Like this effort of solidarity or this like token symbol, I think it can be risky, but I think at the same time, we shouldn't dilute the power of the hijab either. I think there's a lot of Muslims who say, hijab is just a headscarf. Like it's just one thing. Like it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. I definitely think hijab is a big deal. I think it's a act of defiance, and I think if someone wants to engage in that, in solidarity with Muslim women, tending to the sensitivities of Muslim women and kind of leaning on them or asking them, is this appropriate? Then I don't have a problem with that. I think in general, like we have a habit of being outraged by a lot of things, and we kind of miss the forest for the trees. So I think we need to like focus on what's the big picture here? Like, what are the massive efforts that are being undertaken by like a global Islamophobia industry or by these like modern nation states to dilute Islam and not focus so much on individual non-Muslims who are just trying to do their best, Like we should be supporting them in their attempt to support us.
What are some of the preconditions that you see in allyship, where people are trying to be allies to Muslims, but they have conditions, they have strings attached?
Well, I think there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? That's what we say in America.
Oh, yeah.
There's always preconditions. I think we need to be very frank about what those preconditions are. I think Muslim communities need to be smarter about engaging with different institutions or organizations. And I think we need to recognize, for example, that, like after the New Zealand attack, every masjid or mosque was on high alert about their security concerns. And so many of them brought in the police or the FBI to kind of go over the security protocols. And it's like, we really have to be more self-aware, right? We have to be.
They're like calling the FBI, and then like the phone
quite
rings.
Literally.
Like the phone rings next to them. It's somebody's cell phone.
Yeah.
Because they already have agents there or something.
Yeah. Like we don't need to be inviting the feds in to the masjid because we're so scared of being attacked. Like we need to know who our allies are. We need to know what the conditions are. I have no problem with seeking allies who are not Muslim. That's not the problem. The problem is if we don't have a frank conversation about what our red lines are, we're never going to get anywhere. And so that's a conversation that needs to happen internally within the Muslim community. And the problem, one of the beauties of Islam is that, again, we don't have that monoculture, right? Like we don't have a hegemonic system of this is how exactly every situation needs to be dealt with. But I think that can be risky as well because every community kind of stumbles if we don't have that like internal communication of like, these are our red lines and this isn't appropriate. And I think that's why we see a lot of, I hate to call Muslims, like I hate to say things like liberal Muslims or progressive Muslims, but essentially Muslims that have kind of like internalized this liberalism and are pushing for things that are not appropriate, like working with the feds or working towards this like vague sense of patriotism. I think that can be really damaging to the Muslim community in general. So we need to hold those individuals accountable and we need to have more like internal dialogue about that as well.
What was your religious upbringing like?
So both my parents, alhamdulillah, or thank God, are religious. They're practicing. So I learned faith primarily through them. And then I think as all people do, like once I got a bit older, I began to kind of discover Islam on my own and started asking questions. And so, I was blessed to have teachers and friends and people to guide me along the way. And my parents, know enough about Islam when I had questions, they could answer them or they could point me in the right direction. So I never had like a huge crisis of faith or anything like that. Alhamdulillah, like hopefully I will never have that.
Not yet. Right?
Yeah, not yet. Hopefully I will never have that, but I've been blessed in that regard. And I think, we were talking about Twitter earlier. I think Twitter is really unique in kind of connecting you to a community that you might not have access to otherwise. And I think I grew up in a small town in Connecticut where there were not that many Muslims and not people who were, and even if there were Muslims, they weren't thinking about it in a big picture way. And so Twitter really connected me with a great group of individuals. We call it Muslim Twitter, but,
right.
A group of people who are talking about these things in an intellectual or academic or global sense. And so I'm really, really thankful for that as well.
How's your relationship with people who are not, people who are, I guess you would say, cultural Muslims in Connecticut? How do you relate to them?
I don't have a problem relating to them in the sense that, I pray for their guidance. I try to, help them understand certain things. But I also recognize that it's really difficult to confront, the attempt of the state or the attempt of like our media or our dominant culture in kind of watering down Islam. And I think a lot of people don't recognize how many Muslims inherit the religion from their parents and don't learn it for themselves. And so something we're trying to do at Traversing Tradition and institutions like the Yaqeen Institute and, other, great Muslim organizations are trying to do is make Islam more accessible for the average Muslim who never really had the opportunity to learn their religion in an academic way. And make it more accessible to them so that they can start to do that. So I don't have a problem relating to cultural Muslims per se. Everyone's on their own journey to God, sure. And I hope everyone gets where they need to be. But all we can do is pray for each other's guidance and help each other out. And I'm sure there's things that I'm stumbling about that they can help me with.
There are a lot of people. I mean, I think one of the dominant narratives is the person who used to be traditional or came from a traditional background. Perhaps your parents were immigrants or your parents were conservative, and then you grew up and then you entered, became a teenager, and then you lost that, and you became liberal or you became worldly, and now you've arrived at this wonderful place. And I see that narrative, and that's not just the big broad narrative of liberalism, but I see individuals who all have that story where, and as a comedian, that's a really common comedian story to have, where people joke about their very traditional parents and or their very traditional background or like their racist uncle, but now they're not. Now they've come. It's almost like a conversion story, I guess, where they're like telling you how they converted to your ideology, and but it's always jarring when you are someone who went the other way, who has become more devout or perhaps stayed devout, and people are like, haven't you, like, why aren't you going this direction? You're going the wrong way.
Yeah, I think there's significant like cultural capital or like social capital associated with that type of conversion, right? To say, oh, I was so naive and ignorant and traditional, and now I'm woke, now I'm enlightened, now I've like, swallowed this pill, and I'm just like you. So I think there's so much capital associated with that, like people, so many of these like so-called Muslim comedians, I'm thinking of people like Aziz Ansari, who very openly says, I don't practice Islam, but is still called a Muslim by the media. How they use that like story for their own gain, for like commercial gain. So I think it's so easy to do that. And I think the problem is, that a lot of young Muslims, when we're kind of growing up, we don't have access to institutions or resources that kind of explain the big picture topics that we're kind of dealing with in our coming to age, passage, or if you will, like these questions about human rights or science and religion, or, all these like questions that people think are incompatible with religion. If we don't have accessible resources for people, they are very naturally going to accept that, oh, only liberalism has the answers, or only like, the absence of religion kind of opens up my mind to rationalism. And that's where enlightenment is. So I think like we need to build those institutions, and we need to recognize that people who have stayed devout have done so for a reason, right? I think there's this tendency, especially amongst immigrant children, or first generation children, to kind of, or even like the children of traditional parents, to kind of look down on our parents or our parents' generation and say like they were so naive or so ignorant. And there's so much arrogance associated with that. Like I have a very difficult time accepting the fact that our parents didn't deal with these questions, like how could it be that they never thought about this? Like they did think about it, and it's your arrogance that kind of blinds you to it. The reason they stayed devout and stayed traditional is because there's something meaningful there. It's not because they're stupid. And I think we need to kind of get over our ignorance and recognize that. And that's difficult for like any teenager or young adult to do. And I think that type of arrogance, when it's rewarded with social capital, only continues, when you can commercialize it, when you can create an entire career off of that arrogance and saying everyone is stupider or more stupid, whatever, and everyone is ignorant and I am enlightened, then why would you ever give that up? So we need to stop rewarding people like that, and also like build our own institutions, build these like structures that reward people who have the humility to understand that, intellectual humility, to recognize that we don't have all the answers and there is value in what our parents taught us.
What effects have you seen at all, if any, of yourself on friends of yours that are non-Muslim? In terms of, I know that in my own life, I feel, and maybe it's jealousy or envy or whatever, but I feel I've become much more devout the more I hang around Muslims, because there's that kind of like, oh, why am I not praying that often, kind of thing. And I don't know if you've had that kind of interaction with non-Muslims.
So some of my best friends, other than like Muslim best friends, are Catholics, actually. So I lived with two Catholic girls. They're my still like very good friends. And so like we would have these conversations about faith and religion. And one of my best friends was raised Hindu, but, no longer adheres to it. And I think all of us together were able to like have these conversations about religion, about life, about, like these heavy existential topics. I can't claim that I've, had some significant, like it would be so arrogant of me to say that. So I can't really say that, but I can say that, they're very, very accommodating and they're very lovely. Like when I pray, they'll always like turn off music or like leave the room if they're on the phone or something like that, so like they understand the way I live my life as a Muslim and they accept it and, like support it and encourage me, and I hope vice versa as well.
That's great. Well, Eeman, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for chatting and taking time outside of your busy Twitter schedule to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
I appreciate you too. Well, that's it for this episode of Holy Wars. I'd like to thank everyone who donated on Patreon, and I would ask everyone who is listening to do the same. We'll see you next time. Thank you.